The file folder closed with a dry snap as 40 refugees remained crouched in the dark, 200 meters ahead. Sudanese soldiers would begin their round in 17 minutes, and Gad Shimron had just received news that the boat was not coming. This was night number 147 of the Cold War's most audacious intelligence operation. A fake diving resort on the Sudanese coast would smuggle 3,000 Ethiopian Jews to freedom before everything collapsed. One wrong move meant execution. An informer meant international incident. A suspicious neighbor meant 8,000 people dead in camps while the world looked the other way. The Land Rover's headlights cut through the darkness at 3:13 in the morning. Shimron turned off the engine 200 meters from the beach and remained in complete silence. The Red Sea beat against the shore, but beneath it came voices, speaking Amharic and Tigrinya. He counted at least 40 people down there in the dark, all waiting for a boat that was now 17 minutes late. Shimron was 34 years old, spoke 7 languages, and had commanded this route for 6 months, extracting Ethiopian Jews through hostile territory. Each run carried the same calculation. Sudanese military patrols swept this coast twice a night, and an Egyptian radar operator paying attention meant everyone would die. A shape emerged from the darkness. Shimron's hand went for the Beretta 92 under the seat before he recognized Ferdlam. Farad was 19, spoke 5 languages, and had walked 370 kilometers to reach the refugee camps. His 3 sisters did not survive the journey. He knocked twice, the signal meaning the group was ready. Farad leaned in close. The refugees had been hiding in a dry valley since yesterday morning. No food for 36 hours. 2 children showing dehydration. An old man named Yosef with a fever. They could not return to the camps now. If the boat did not come, Yosef would not survive another day without water. The plan was brutal. If soldiers appeared, Shimron had 30 seconds to drive north before they set up an ambush. The refugees would scatter. Most would be captured, some would die of thirst. Those who were caught would eventually talk about the European man who had promised passage to Israel. A diesel engine rumbled on the water. 23 minutes late. After 90 seconds, Shimron saw it. A fishing dhow sailing without lights at 8 knots. The boat anchored 47 meters from the coast. Shimron entered the water first, feeling the shock of the cold against his legs. He reached the boat and climbed aboard to confirm the agreement with the captain, a Somali named Gad with scarred hands. Gad confirmed the payment, 2,500 now. 2,500 at the meeting point, where an Israeli Navy missile boat was waiting in international waters. Shimron handed over the money. "No one is left behind," he said. "If someone drowns, the second payment disappears." The refugees began coming through the water, and the operation immediately collapsed. Children panicked, grasping onto their parents and screaming. A woman carrying a baby slipped under, and 2 men pulled her back as the baby wailed. 4 men carried Yosef through the waves as he murmured prayers. It took 11 minutes to get everyone aboard. Every minute was another chance for a patrol to notice something wrong on a beach that was supposed to be empty. Shimron climbed the rope ladder last. As he pulled himself onto the deck, he heard a vehicle engine on the coastal road approaching quickly. He turned and saw headlights maybe 2 kilometers away. Military trucks used this road. He could see 2 vehicles. Sudanese soldiers patrolled in pairs, one with infantry, one with a mounted PKM machine gun. The dhow's engine coughed and caught, black smoke pouring from the exhaust. Shimron drew his Beretta and chambered around. Farad stood beside him as the vehicles reached the beach and stopped. Doors opened. 6 men, all armed with AKM rifles, one pointing at the dhow and shouting orders. The first shot cracked over the water at 3:37. The bullet passed overhead. Warning shots or bad aim. The dhow was 170 meters from the coast now. More shots followed, maybe 15 bullets. The refugees screamed and lay flat on the floor. A woman prayed in a loud, lamenting voice. Gad kept the throttle wide open. At 300 meters, the shooting stopped. Shimron told Gad to turn off the navigation lights and hold the course due east, then went below to check on the refugees. They were terrified, but intact. No one hit. 43 people huddled in the cramped hold that reeked of fish guts, diesel fuel, and human fear. Farad was with Yosef. The old man's breathing was shallow, his skin burning with fever. He needed a doctor, and antibiotics they did not have. Maybe he would make it to the meeting point, maybe not. Shimron climbed back onto the deck and grabbed a portable radio, sending a prearranged sequence of clicks. Package underway. Encountered resistance. Continuing to rendezvous. He waited for a response. Protocol said 30 seconds. 72 seconds passed before the radio clicked back. Message received. Vessel in position. Shimron breathed a sigh of relief. Farad stood beside him, looking back at the coast. He had grown up in a village called Walika in northern Ethiopia, part of an ancient Jewish community isolated for 2,500 years. Now he was on a smuggling dhow at 3:51 in the morning, heading toward a country he had never seen but had been taught to call home. Shimron asked how many more were waiting in the camps. Farad gave a number that made Shimron's stomach drop. Maybe 8,000, possibly 10,000. New refugees arrived from Ethiopia every week, fleeing persecution and famine. Everyone in those camps knew that reaching Israel was their only chance. The numbers were impossible. At the current rate, it would take 16 years. They did not have 16 years. 57 minutes after leaving the beach, Shimron saw lights on the horizon. An Israeli Navy missile boat holding position at the designated coordinates. 22 minutes later, they were alongside, and sailors helped the refugees climb aboard, while a doctor went straight to Yosef. Lieutenant Dormour found Shimron at the top of the ladder. Shimron told him about the military patrol, the shooting, the near miss. Doctor mentioned something that chilled Shimron's blood. Egyptian Air Force radar had tracked an unidentified vessel 42 minutes ago. They vectored a Mirage fighter, but cancelled when the vessel entered international waters. So the Egyptians knew something was happening. They had not intercepted tonight, but they were watching. 3 days later in Tel Aviv, Shimron sat in a sterile conference room on the 14th floor of an office building that officially housed an import-export company. Rachel was there, along with Danny Limor and 2 other operatives whose real names he had never known. Everyone looked exhausted. The operation was 18 months old, and the fatigue was showing. Rachel had lost 12 kilos since arriving in Sudan. Danny developed a persistent cough doctors could not diagnose. The stress of maintaining false identities for prolonged periods was taking its toll. The operation had begun with a simple observation made by an Israeli intelligence analyst in January 1980. Thousands of Ethiopian Jews were fleeing famine and persecution, concentrating in refugee camps in eastern Sudan. Sudan maintained diplomatic relations with the Arab League and refused to allow Israel to operate officially on its territory. Traditional diplomatic channels were impossible. Aerial rescue operations would be detected. Land transport through Egypt was impractical due to security surveillance. Only one option remained: a clandestine maritime operation operating under deep commercial cover. The idea of a diving resort emerged during a 3-day planning session in March. The Sudanese Red Sea coast was experiencing a modest tourism boom. European operators were establishing small resorts, catering to divers interested in the relatively untouched coral reefs. An Israeli resort would stand out. A European resort run by staff who spoke multiple languages would go unnoticed. The cover would provide legitimate explanation for vessels, night movement, and radio communications. It would also generate real revenue to sustain the operation and create the appearance of a legitimate business. Shimron was recruited in April. His background included 7 years in special operations, fluency in Arabic, French, German, and English, plus extensive training in maritime operations. Most importantly, he had grown up on a kibbutz on the coast and understood vessels and navigation intuitively. He would pose as an experienced Swiss diver named Max Rose, running a boutique diving resort aimed at wealthy European tourists seeking authentic Red Sea experiences. Rachel arrived in May. Officially, she was a German diving instructor with advanced certification and 5 years of experience in Mediterranean resorts. In reality, she had spent 8 years in intelligence operations, including 2 prolonged deep cover missions in Eastern Europe. Her job would be to manage the resort's daily operations, interact with local authorities, and maintain the appearance of a legitimate tourist business. The Arus holiday village was established in June 1980 on an isolated stretch of coast, 40 kilometers north of Port Sudan. The location offered direct access to the sea, privacy from casual observation, and reasonable proximity to the inland refugee camps. Construction was carried out by a legitimate Sudanese company using materials imported from Europe. The result was a functional resort with 12 bungalows, diving facilities, a restaurant and a bar that could accommodate up to 40 guests. The first customers arrived in August, German and French divers who had booked through legitimate European travel agencies. They spent a week exploring the coral reefs, eating fresh seafood, and drinking imported German beer. Their reviews were positive. TripAdvisor did not exist yet, but word-of-mouth recommendations began circulating through the international diving community. The Arouse holiday village was establishing a reputation as an authentic and well-managed destination. Meanwhile, Shimron established contact with refugee communities inland. The process was delicate and time-consuming. Ethiopian refugees were naturally suspicious of strangers making grandiose promises. Many had been cheated before by smugglers who took their money and abandoned them. Shimron needed to build trust gradually, demonstrating real capacity to deliver what he promised. Farad became his main contact in the camps. At 19, he had become an informal leader among the refugees due to his education. He had completed high school, language skills, and ability to navigate both camp politics and the complexities of relationships with Sudanese authorities. Farad understood that any rescue operation would need to be carefully managed to avoid drawing attention that could result in the closure of the entire pipeline. The first extractions began in September. Small groups of 5 to 8 people moved during moonless nights, transported by small fishing boats to Israeli ships waiting in international waters. Each operation was meticulously planned. Shimron studied patrol patterns, weather conditions, moon phases, and tide schedules. Escape routes were mapped. Emergency meeting points were established. Communication procedures were rehearsed until they became automatic. The resort provided perfect cover. Legitimate guests provided surface activity that masked operational movements. Diving vessels explained nighttime maritime traffic. Radio equipment for coordinating dives explained communications. The operation was hidden within a functioning business that generated real revenue and employed genuine local staff who did not know its true nature. By December, they had extracted 237 people. The number was significant, but tiny compared with the total population of the camps. Shimron calculated that at the current rate, it would take more than 15 years to evacuate everyone who needed rescue. The problem was not logistics or operational security. The problem was scale. They needed to expand operations significantly or accept that most people in the camps would never leave. The decision to expand was made in Tel Aviv in January 1981. Additional resources were allocated, more operatives were recruited, larger vessels were acquired. Operational procedures were refined to handle larger groups. The goal was to triple the extraction rate within 6 months. This meant more frequent operations, larger groups, and correspondingly greater risks of discovery. Danny Limor arrived at the Arouse holiday village in March 1981, officially as a French diving instructor specializing in technical diving and underwater photography. In reality, he was a communications specialist with 15 years of experience in military and civilian radio systems. His role would be to establish more robust communications between the resort, extraction vessels, and Israeli ships operating in international waters. The expansion required significant operational changes. Extraction groups increased from 8 to 15 people. The frequency of operations doubled from twice a month to once a week. Larger vessels were required to handle the increased volume, but larger vessels were more visible and harder to explain as normal diving equipment. The balance between operational scale and security of the operation was becoming more precarious. Rachel developed a system to manage the increased flow of refugees through the camps. Working through Farad and other local contacts, she established schedules that spread out arrivals and departures to avoid visible concentrations of people waiting for extraction. Families were split into smaller groups that arrived at the extraction point at different times to reduce the size of any single gathering. Backup systems were created to handle situations where operations needed to be aborted or delayed. By May, they were extracting 60 people a month. By July, the number had increased to 80. By September, it was approaching 100. The increased volume meant that the operation was having a real impact on the camp population, but it also meant that more people were aware that something was happening. Sudanese authorities began noticing patterns. Camp officials asked questions about why certain people were disappearing. Local informers began reporting unusual activity on the coast. The first sign of real trouble came in October. A Sudanese security official showed up at the resort, asking questions about nighttime activities. Shimron, posing as Max Rose, explained that they occasionally organized night dives for guests interested in observing nocturnal marine life. Night diving was a legitimate activity offered by many diving resorts. The officials seemed to accept the explanation, but his presence indicated that someone had reported unusual movement. Rachel implemented additional security measures. Legitimate night dives were organized with real guests to create a normal appearance. Detailed logs were kept showing regular schedules of diving activities that could be presented if questions arose again. Local staff were instructed to emphasize to anyone asking that the resort operated both day and night dives as part of its normal services. By November, the operation was extracting 120 people a month. The volume was approaching the limits of what could be managed safely. Each operation now involved 20 to 25 refugees, requiring larger vessels and longer periods on the water. More time on the water meant greater exposure to patrols. Larger vessels were more difficult to hide and more likely to be noticed by radar. Shimron began developing contingency plans for different compromise scenarios. If the operation were discovered, protocol required immediate evacuation of all Israeli operatives. Equipment would be destroyed. Cover stories would be activated. Local employees who did not know about the true nature of the operation would be left to deal with the consequences. The brutal reality was that protecting the operation sometimes required sacrificing people who had helped make it possible. In December, they received intelligence indicating that Egyptian authorities were paying closer attention to maritime traffic in the area. Egyptian radar had begun tracking unidentified vessels more systematically. Egyptian naval patrols had increased in frequency. While Egypt wasn't directly threatening the operation, increased Egyptian vigilance meant greater risk of detection and potential for diplomatic complications if anything went wrong. Despite the rising risks, the decision was made to continue and even slightly expand operations through the winter months. Weather conditions during winter were actually more favorable for covert maritime operations. Fewer commercial fishing vessels meant less chance of accidental discovery. Reduced tourist season meant that odd behavior at a resort would be less likely to attract attention from casual observers. By the end of 1981, the operation had successfully extracted over 1,200 people. Numbers were becoming statistically significant, noticeably reducing population pressure in refugee camps and creating a visible impact on the ground. But success was also creating new problems. More people in the camps now knew about the rescue pipeline, creating security risks. Expectations were rising faster than capacity to deliver, and every successful extraction was creating an intelligence trail that eventually someone would notice and investigate. The year 1982 brought changes that would ultimately determine the fate of the operation. In January, Jerome McDonnell, a Washington Post correspondent based in Cairo, began investigating reports of unusual activity among Ethiopian refugee communities. McDonnell was an experienced journalist who had spent considerable time covering Middle Eastern affairs and had developed an extensive network of contacts throughout the region. Initial reports that reached McDonnell were vague. Rumors about refugees disappearing from camps, stories about mysterious Europeans offering passage to Israel, unconfirmed sightings of small boats operating along the Sudanese coast during new moon periods. Individually, these reports seemed insignificant. Collectively, they suggested something systematic was happening that deserved investigation. McDonnell's background made him particularly dangerous for the operation. He spoke Arabic fluently, understood regional politics intimately, and had contacts within various government agencies that could provide information about unusual activities. More importantly, he had experience uncovering covert operations and understood how intelligence services typically operated in the region. Shimron first learned about McDonnell's interest in February through Farad, who had been approached by someone claiming to be a research assistant working for an American journalist. The approach had been casual: questions about refugee experiences, general inquiries about life in the camps, seemingly innocent requests for information about how people survived and what their hopes were for the future. Farad immediately recognized the potential danger. He deflected the questions artfully and reported the contact to Shimron immediately. But the fact that a journalist was asking any questions about refugee experiences suggested that suspicions existed and an investigation was beginning. The decision was made to implement enhanced security measures and begin planning for potential emergency evacuation if the investigation progressed too far. Enhanced security meant several changes to operational procedures. Extraction operations were spaced further apart, temporarily, to reduce detectable patterns. Group sizes were reduced back to earlier levels to minimize exposure during each operation. Additional cover activities were implemented at the resort to strengthen the appearance of a normal tourist business. Most importantly, contingency plans were refined for rapid evacuation of all Israeli personnel if compromise became imminent. Despite the precautions, McDonnell's investigation continued through the spring. He interviewed refugees in multiple camps, spoke with local officials, and began mapping patterns of disappearances that were becoming statistically visible. By May, he had identified approximate areas where extractions were occurring and had narrowed down possible explanations for what was happening. In June, McDonnell took a trip along the Sudanese coast, ostensibly to research a story about the development of the tourism industry. He visited multiple resorts and business establishments, including the Arus holiday village. Shimron, maintaining his Max Rose identity, provided a normal tour for a visiting journalist interested in learning about the diving industry. McDonnell asked routine questions about business operations, customer demographics, and the challenges of operating a tourism business in a remote location. Nothing about the interview seemed suspicious, but McDonnell was an experienced investigative journalist. He was looking for inconsistencies, unusual details, anything that didn't quite fit expected patterns. Later analysis of the interview revealed that McDonnell had picked up several subtle indicators that something wasn't quite normal about the Arouse Holiday Village operations. First, staff seemed unusually well-trained and professional for a remote location tourism business. Second, communications equipment was more sophisticated than typically necessary for a diving resort. Third, boat maintenance facilities were larger and more comprehensive than would be expected for the reported level of tourist traffic. Individually, none of these observations were conclusive. Together, they suggested that the resort might be serving functions beyond simple tourism. In July, McDonnell began focusing his investigation specifically on maritime activities along the coast. He studied shipping records, interviewed local fishermen, and analyzed patterns of naval traffic through the region. Gradually, he began identifying anomalies that suggested regular, undocumented maritime operations were occurring in the area near the Arus holiday village. A critical breakthrough came in August, when McDonnell interviewed a local fisherman who had witnessed an extraction operation from a distance. The fisherman had seen people boarding boats in the dark, transfers to larger vessels offshore, and coordination that indicated a sophisticated operation rather than random smuggling. While the fisherman couldn't provide definitive proof of what he had seen, his description was detailed enough to convince McDonnell that a significant covert operation was occurring. In September, McDonnell attempted to obtain confirmation through official channels. He reached out to contacts in Egyptian intelligence, Sudanese security services, and even Israeli diplomatic circles. None would provide official comment, but responses indicated that his suspicions were well-founded and that the operation he was investigating was real and significant. By October, McDonnell had assembled enough evidence to write an exposé that would blow the operation wide open. He had documentary evidence of unusual refugee movements, witness testimony about maritime operations, and analysis of patterns that indicated systematic rescue operations were occurring. While he couldn't prove Israeli involvement definitively, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The decision to publish posed a complex ethical dilemma for McDonnell. Publishing would certainly end rescue operations that were saving lives. But the operations were violating Sudanese sovereignty and potentially destabilizing regional diplomatic relationships. Additionally, the public had a right to know about covert operations being conducted by foreign intelligence services in the region. McDonnell ultimately decided to proceed with publication, but first attempted to contact Israeli authorities to get an official response. Through intermediaries, a message was conveyed to the relevant Israeli agencies that the story was going to be published and that a response would be welcomed. The Israeli response was predictable, neither confirmation nor denial, but a clear indication that publication would have serious consequences for ongoing humanitarian operations. The story was published in December 1982. Secret Israeli operation extracts Ethiopian Jews through Sudanese resort ran on the Washington Post front page, with a detailed description of the operations, interviews with refugees who had been rescued, and an analysis of the diplomatic implications. The story provided enough detail to make continued operations impossible. The Sudanese government reacted immediately. A Rouse holiday village was closed within 24 hours. All Israeli personnel were ordered to leave the country immediately. A diplomatic protest was filed, with Israel charging a violation of sovereignty. Public embarrassment forced Sudanese authorities to take action that they had previously chosen to ignore. The collapse of the operation in December 1982 forced an emergency evacuation that had been meticulously planned but never implemented. Shimron received the order to abort at 2 in the morning on December 12th, 18 hours after the Washington Post article was published. Rachel was with a group of 23 refugees waiting for extraction when the message came over the radio. Danny Limor was coordinating communications from an outpost 10 kilometers inland. Everyone needed to be out of Sudan within 72 hours. The evacuation revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the operational planning. Sensitive equipment was destroyed systematically, using pre-established protocols. Records were burned, communication systems were dismantled and their parts dispersed. The resort was left looking exactly like what it had pretended to be, a failed tourist business that was closing due to financial difficulties. Local employees who worked at the resort were informed that the operation was closing due to economic problems. They received generous severance payments and letters of recommendation for use in future jobs. Most genuinely believed they had worked for a legitimate diving resort that simply failed to remain profitable in a remote location. Rachel managed to evacuate all 23 refugees who were waiting for extraction, but only by organizing an unauthorized final operation that directly violated the orders to abort. She justified the decision by arguing that abandoning people who had already left the camps would mean condemning them to certain death at the hands of the Sudanese authorities. The final extraction was performed without communication support and without backup, drastically increasing the risks for everyone involved. Shimron was the last Israeli operative to leave Sudan, departing on a commercial flight from Port Sudan to Cairo on December 15th. He carried Swiss identification documents that would show routine verification and a cover story about being a disappointed tourism entrepreneur who was liquidating a failed investment. Sudanese authorities allowed his departure without question, seemingly satisfied that the problem had been resolved. The impact of the exposure extended far beyond the closing of the immediate operation. Sudanese authorities, publicly embarrassed, implemented draconian security measures in the refugee camps. Movement was severely restricted. Contacts with foreigners were forbidden. Anyone suspected of involvement with previous smuggling operations faced interrogation and possible imprisonment. Farad was arrested 3 days after the resort closed. Sudanese authorities identified him as a liaison figure based on testimony from other refugees who were trying to avoid suspicion on themselves. He was held for 6 weeks in a Port Sudan prison, during which he was interrogated extensively about the extent of his knowledge and involvement in the Israeli operation. During the interrogation, Farad revealed enough information to satisfy the interrogators that he was cooperating, but managed to protect other refugees who had been involved in operational details that could compromise future operations. His strategy was to admit his own involvement while minimizing the scope of the operation and the number of people who knew about it. Farad was finally released in February 1983, but conditions in the camps had deteriorated significantly. The security restrictions made any future rescue operation almost impossible. International humanitarian organizations were subjected to intense scrutiny. Journalists were banned from the camps. The pipeline that had worked for almost 3 years was effectively eliminated. For the refugees who remained in the camps, the closing of the operation represented a catastrophe. Around 8,000 people who had waited for extraction were left without a realistic prospect of escape. The already difficult conditions became even worse as Sudanese authorities, now alert to smuggling activities, implemented restrictions that made daily life even harder. In Tel Aviv, post-operational analyses attempted to determine lessons learned and implications for future operations. The operation had been a significant tactical success. Over 3,000 people were successfully rescued over 3 years without the loss of a single operative to capture or death. At the same time, it had been a strategic failure in the sense that the exposure had effectively eliminated any possibility of continued rescue operations. The post-operational investigation revealed several vulnerabilities that had contributed to the discovery. The operation had become too large and too visible to remain secret indefinitely. The volume of people being extracted had created detectable statistical patterns. Success had generated expectations that led more people to talk about the operation than should have been considered safe. More fundamentally, the operation had assumed that it could run indefinitely without journalistic or intelligence scrutiny. This assumption proved to be incorrect. Jerome McDonnell had demonstrated that experienced investigative journalists could uncover sophisticated operations through careful reporting and pattern analysis. The operation had not developed adequate countermeasures against journalistic investigation. The implications extended beyond the specific operation. The exposure had compromised operational methods that could have been used in future operations. It had revealed Israeli capabilities that would now be anticipated by adversary intelligence services. It had created a diplomatic precedent that would make similar operations harder to justify or cover up if discovered. For Shimron personally, the end of the operation brought a mix of relief and regret that would persist for the rest of his life. Relief came from the end of the constant stress of maintaining a false identity under hostile surveillance. Regret came from the knowledge that thousands of people who could have been rescued were left behind when the operation ended. 3 decades after the operation's closure, Shimron reflected on its significance in an interview conducted at his home in Tel Aviv in 2012. At 65, he had become a respected security consultant, but the diving resort experience remained the defining event of his career. His reflections revealed the enduring complexity of the operation and its impacts that extended far beyond the numbers of people rescued. From a purely operational standpoint, Shimron considered the mission a qualified success. 3,074 people had been successfully extracted during the 3 years of the operation. No Israeli operative had been captured or killed. The cover had been maintained for an extraordinarily long period for an operation of such scale and complexity. By traditional intelligence standards, these were impressive results. But Shimron also recognized the limitations and costs of the approach. Approximately 8,000 people had remained in the camps when the operation ended, many of whom died in the following decades due to camp conditions, famine, and violence. The operation had rescued a significant minority, but still a minority of the people who needed help. Partial success meant partial failure too. The moral dimensions of the operation were even more complex. Decisions about who to extract and when had been made based on operational logistics and security, rather than humanitarian need. Families had been temporarily separated, when only some members could be included in specific operations. Some people had waited years for extraction that never came. Others had been rescued within weeks of arriving at the camps. Rachel, who participated in the same interview, emphasized the collaborative aspects of the operation that were often lost in accounts focused exclusively on the Israeli operatives. The Ethiopian refugees had not been passive recipients of assistance, but active participants who contributed to the success of the operation through their own courage, discipline, and sacrifice. Farad, now a professor of Ethiopian studies at the Hebrew University, offered a perspective on the long-term impact of the operation within the Ethiopian Israeli community. The people extracted through the diving resort had become nuclei of extended families and community networks that eventually included tens of thousands of people. The multiplier effect meant that the real impact of the operation was much greater than the initial extraction numbers suggest. Some of those extracted through the operation had become prominent figures in Israeli society. Sarah Yosef, who had been a 7-year-old child during her extraction, became a medical student at Ben-Gurion University. Mehari Tashom, extracted at age 15, became an officer in the Israel Defense Forces. Dozens of others had become teachers, nurses, engineers, and entrepreneurs who contributed to Israeli society while maintaining connections to their Ethiopian heritage. But integration had not been automatic or easy. Many of the rescued faced significant discrimination, economic barriers, and cultural challenges. The trauma of leaving families behind, years in refugee camps, and the difficulties of adapting to a completely different society had left lasting scars. The physical rescue had been only the first step in a much longer and more complex adaptation process. The operation had also influenced the development of Israeli intelligence doctrine in ways that extended far beyond humanitarian operations. The deep cover techniques developed for the diving resort were adapted for other operations. The methods of coordination between surface and maritime teams informed later operations. The lessons about the long-term sustainability of clandestine operations became part of the intelligence training curriculum. Internationally, the operation had set precedents for the use of intelligence methods for humanitarian purposes. Other agencies had studied the operation and adapted its techniques for their own rescue operations. The demonstration that complex, long-term operations could be conducted under deep commercial cover influenced operational planning beyond Israel. McDonnell, the journalist whose investigation had exposed the operation, eventually wrote a book about the experience that explored the ethical dimensions of investigative journalism when lives are at stake. He had faced significant criticism from some quarters for ending an operation that was saving lives, but he maintained that journalistic transparency was necessary for democratic accountability, even when the immediate costs were painful. The question of whether McDonnell should have published the story remained controversial decades later. Supporters argued that clandestine operations, regardless of their humanitarian goals, should not operate without public oversight. Critics maintained that the exposure had condemned thousands of people to unnecessary death. The moral complexity of the situation resisted simple resolutions. Shimron himself expressed ambivalent feelings about McDonnell and the decision to publish. He understood the journalistic logic and respected the quality of McDonnell's investigation. At the same time, he carried the weight of knowing how many people who could have been saved were not due to the timing of the exposure. The conflict between abstract principles and specific human consequences was never fully resolved in his mind. In 2020, when Shimron was 73, he participated in a reunion in Tel Aviv with 15 people who had been extracted through the diving resort operation. The event was organized by Sarah Yosef, now a practicing physician with her own family. The reunion was an opportunity for reflection on how everyone's lives had unfolded in the decades since the operation. The stories shared during the reunion revealed the diversity of experiences among those who had been rescued. Some had prospered economically and professionally. Others had struggled with adaptation and never felt completely at home in Israel. Many had lost touch with family members left behind in Ethiopia. Some had managed to eventually bring other family members to Israel through later official channels. What emerged clearly from the reunion was that the rescue operation had been only the beginning of much longer and more complex journeys. Success could not be measured solely by physical extraction, but needed to take into account decades of adaptation, integration, and building new lives. By this measure, the operation had enabled both notable successes and painful struggles. Shimron died in 2023 at age 78. His obituary in Haaretz prominently mentioned the mission, describing it as one of the most remarkable intelligence operations in Israeli history and one of the most effective humanitarian rescue missions of the Cold War era. Former team members and rescued refugees attended his funeral in Jerusalem, gathering to honor a man who had dedicated 4 years to an impossible mission and carried the weight of its successes and failures for the rest of his days. The operation's legacy persisted in ways that transcended physical locations. It demonstrated that clandestine intelligence operations could serve humanitarian purposes, that the tools of espionage could be redirected to save lives instead of just collecting secrets. The model influenced subsequent rescue missions and humanitarian interventions, providing proof that small teams operating under deep cover could achieve things that official channels could not. The operation also revealed the psychological costs of sustained deception and the moral complexity of humanitarian work conducted through intelligence methods. Team members carried lasting scars from years of maintaining false identities while watching people die from problems they could not solve quickly enough. The ethical questions about who was rescued and who was not, about which lives were saved at what cost, persisted long after and could never be fully resolved. Ultimately, the Red Sea diving resort operation succeeded in its immediate goal of extracting thousands of Ethiopian Jews from Sudan during a critical period when other rescue methods were unavailable. It failed in its broader aspiration to solve the humanitarian crisis facing the entire Ethiopian Jewish community. Both the success and the failure were real and important. Understanding the operation required holding both truths simultaneously without diminishing either one.